In today's session, we are going to be talking about making conditional interactions, and we'll be focusing on just a couple of triggers and something called a condition. But before I jump into that, I'd like to just jump back and do a quick review of what you might have learned in the last session. So if we take a look at, give me a second here. So if we go back to previous one, which is, where are you? That's not the right one. We talked about native sensors. So things like using the tilt function on your phone and the what just happened? Oh my goodness, I am sorry, people. Are you guys seeing my screen again? My screen just went dark for a second. I want to make sure everything's working. Okay, great. So we talked about native sensors in the previous one, and that was using things like the tilts, vibration, things like that in your phone. In today's, we're going to be talking about making conditional interactions. And we're going to be working with two triggers in particular, the chain trigger and the range trigger, and something called a condition. And the condition is not really a response, but it allows your prototype to make a decision on what responses are triggered based on something that is currently happening in your prototype. We'll be going through 3 demos, the first of which is a password field. So this is something common that you'll do in a lot of things. So you'll put in a password, and then when you press the save button, it'll do a comparison to make sure those 2 passwords match. And if they don't, we're going to put this little error thing on there. And if they do, you'll be able to jump on to the next screen. The second demo will be an image slideshow. Now, paging would be something you would have covered in a previous lesson, but right below the paging container, you can see these 3 dots. And what we'd like to do is we'd like the darker dot to move and indicate what page you're currently on. We'll be using something called the chain trigger for that. And on our third demo, we'll be using something called the range trigger. And you can see as we page from one screen to the next, a video starts playing. We'll be using the range trigger to start that video for every time you move to each page. At this point, Rebecca is going to put a link in the chat where you can download the source files. And that link will take you to a page that looks like this. On the right side, a little bit more than halfway down, you'll see a download link. Please download the files, and I'll give you a few minutes for that, and then we'll jump in. Since there's only just a handful of us in here, maybe just pop a message back in the chat to let me know that you've got it downloaded and you've started it in ProtoPie. When you have it open, you should be sitting on a screen that looks something like this. I'll give you a couple more minutes. Does anyone need any more time to download the files? Okay, let's jump in then. On the left side in your scenes palette, and you can get to the scenes by this icon in the top left here, I'd like you to go to the one that says, oh wait, where is it? I'm missing a scene here. Give me 1 second. I'm going to re-download the file. This is crazy. I'm going to download the same file that everyone's got. Oops. All right, let's see. There we go. Sorry, okay, it's the settings scene. Okay, here we go. So we have 6 scenes. We want to go to the settings scene. And this is the one where you have your name and 2 password fields. Now in the layers palette, you'll see that there are 3 layers that we'll be working with in particular, and they're the top 3 ones. This error one, which is currently invisible, and that's what's going to show when the passwords don't match. Then you have the new password field and the confirm new password field. And essentially what we'd want to happen, if I preview this right now, when I type something in this first field, so let's say I type something here and I type something in here, we want our prototype to evaluate whether or not I've typed the same thing in both of these 2 fields. And if they don't, then I want to show that little error icon. And if they do, I want to allow moving on to the next screen when I hit save. So if we take a look at this new password field and the confirm new password field, we want to evaluate whether or not they're the same when we're done typing in the second field. So there's a couple of ways we could do that. We could do it when we click on the save button, and we could do an evaluation whether or not those passwords match, or we can do it when we exit this field. And essentially that means when this input field loses focus. And what we're going to do is we're going to work with that. So if we add a trigger, and we are going to add the focus trigger, and that's the one top right. And we have 2 options for focus. We have focus in and focus out. And we want this trigger to fire when we leave this field. So we're going to use the focus out, and the layer we want is the confirm new password field. And then here, we're going to add something called a condition. And that's this one down here at the bottom. And like I say, it's not quite a response because it doesn't really fit in with the rest of these ones on here. So which is why it kind of sits on its own at the bottom of the list here. And when we say in a condition in here, what we want is, you see, we have some fields at the top. We have these weird looking icons that allow us to choose how we want to compare them. And then we have something on the bottom. So what we're doing is we're comparing something with something else. And in this case, we're going to take the new password field. That's this one right here. And we want to compare its text property. So if we scroll down this list, you're going to see we have text here. And we want to compare it against the confirm new password field's text property. And we want to see if they are equal to each other. And we have some other ones. These are for more numeric things. So greater than or equal, less than or equal. We'll be working with equals, and then the second one does not equal for the second comparison. But in this case, we care about equals. So in the second one, this is what we want to compare it to. And we want from the confirm new password field, CNPW, and its text property. So in this comparison, if the text property of the new password field is the same as the text property of the confirm new password field, we want to make sure that that error icon does not show. So we can add an opacity response under this, opacity of the error icon. And if you can't find the item in the list, it should be at the top, but if you're having trouble finding it, you can just type the name of the layer in here, and it will shortlist to just what you want. We want the error one, and we're going to set the opacity to 0. You can either put the number in directly by typing it, or you can use this slider. Now, in the event that they don't match, we'd like the opposite to happen. We'd like the opacity to go to 100 when they don't match. Now, we can just add another condition and do everything we just did, or we can duplicate the work we've done and just modify it. And that's a little bit faster for us. So if you click on the condition, and you can either copy paste, so Command C, Command V, or Control C, Control V on a PC, or you can duplicate it, and that's Command D on a Mac or Control D on Windows. And you do that, you're going to get a second one right underneath. And now we're going to modify this. If I click on this, in this time, my condition is when they don't match. So I'm going to change the equals to does not equal. That's what this equals with the slash through it means. And I'm going to change what happens as a result. So instead of the opacity going to 0, I'm going to make it go to 100. So before we preview this, I'm just going to review what's going on here. The trigger is on focus out. So when the focus leaves this second field, I have two conditions. I have one condition for when the two passwords match. And what we can do is we can rename this. So if you double click the name of the condition, you can rename it to say passwords match. And I can double click this one and I can say passwords do not match. If the passwords match, I'm going to set the opacity of that error icon to 0. If they do not match, I'm going to set the opacity of this to 100. So this response only fires when this condition is true. This response only fires when this condition is true. If we preview this, and in my new password field, I'm just going to type anything I like and then move on to the next one. And then if let's say I press the tab key or I press enter or anything to move out of that field. So let's say I click off, you're going to say they don't match. The one in the first field is clearly longer than the second one, and I get that icon showing up. But then if I go back and I put in the same thing in both, so I'm going to put in 1, 2, 3, 4 in the first one, and I'm going to change the second one to 1, 2, 3, 4, and maybe I press enter this time, that icon goes away. Now, at the same time here, we want the same evaluation to happen on the save command. When I click on save, I only want to go to this screen if those passwords match. Now you can see in here, we already have this set up. When I tap this on here, the same condition has been set up in here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this whole tap thing and build it right from the ground up so that you can see how to make it. So I'm going to add a tap trigger to the save button. So add trigger. I'm going to add a tap here. And I want to use the same condition. I only want to jump to the next screen when this condition is true. So again, I can add a condition here and go through the long way of setting it all up again, or I can copy what's already been done here. So I can take this one, passwords match, and I can Command C or Control C on Windows, click on the tap trigger, Command V or Control V to paste it. And all I need to do now is change this response. I don't want to change the opacity anymore. What I want to do is add a jump response. So I'm going to remove the opacity one, and I'm going to add a jump response. And the scene I'd like to go to is the home widget. Or I want home widget, or I want IoT home, sorry, IoT home. So if I preview this again, I'm going to type in a password into the first field. And when I click the save button, nothing happens. Now, nothing happens because there's no condition for when the passwords don't match on the tap trigger. There's only a condition for when they do match. So in this case, I'm going to change this to 1, 2, 3, 4. And in the second one, I will do 1, 2, 3, 4. And if everything went right, so first of all, you can see that there is no error icon. And if I click on save, boom, it takes me to the home. All right, before I move on to the next one, that is the condition demo. If anyone has any questions, you can post them in the chat right now, if that's working for everybody or not. Okay, great. I'm assuming that means everything's working for everybody. So we're going to move on to the next one. The next one is something called chain. And the way that chain works, chain is a trigger that allows you to associate the property of one object with another. So in this case, if I play this little video here, there's this red box moving up and down. As I drag the box up and down, its Y property is changing. On the right side, this blue box, its scale is changing in proportion to the Y property of this red box. So what we've done is we've chained the scale property of the blue box to the Y position of the red box. And as the red box changes its Y position, the blue box changes its scale. Now, this is a continuous reaction. So anytime that Y position changes, this scale will change. Here's a more complicated example. So this is one where the all of the elements of the panda's face are chained to the position of the cursor. So you see that translucent circle, that represents my finger moving around on the screen. And as it moves, the eyes follow it around, the ears move a little bit, the mouth moves a little bit. All of these things are happening because of the chain trigger. There's a chain trigger set up for each of these elements chained to the mouse position of that circle. In our demo, we're going to use the chain trigger to animate the little dot on the bottom. You can see the 3 dots that are underneath the paging container here. As I page from one to the next, I'd like that dot to move in sequence to indicate what page that I'm on. So if we jump back into ProtoPie, and we're going to go to the second screen here, the onboarding one. And we have a paging container here. Now you would have learned paging in a previous lesson, but if we preview this, the paging's already been set up for you. So I can move left and right. So I can go to page 1, page 2, page 3. You can see underneath there are 3 dots, 1, 2, 3. One of them is a little bit darker, and I'd like that darker dot to move onto the second and third position as I move to the second and third page, and of course back to the first one. If we take a look at the dots container over here, you can see if I just turn off the dark dot, you can see there are 3 light dots, and they represent the stop positions of where those are going to be. We're going to use those to determine where the dot needs to move to. I'll touch back on that when we get to it. I'm going to turn make sure that dot's back on, make sure you can see it. What we're going to do is we're going to add a chain trigger to the paging container. So that's this one, the one named paging. Make sure that's you've clicked that one in the layers palette, and add the trigger chain. That's the one top middle. Now it's been added to nothing here, so I'm going to need to choose the paging container. And again, if you're not finding it in the list, you can just start typing paging, and it'll shortlist it here. I'll choose paging, and I want to use the scroll position of the paging container. Now the scroll position, if I go back and preview this, the scroll position is the number of pixels that the objects underneath have moved as I scroll left and right. And the way paging works is one page is the full width of the scroll container. So right now I'm on page 1 and the scroll position is 0. And if I go on to page 2, the scroll position is the full width of the container, and the container is 375 pixels. So one full page is 375 pixels. That's going to be important. We need to remember that. 2 pages, of course, would be twice that, so 750 pixels. In our chain, what I'd like to happen is the scroll is, you can think of this as the master, the trigger. So anytime the scroll position changes as a result of us scrolling back and forth, what I'd like to do is change the position of this red dot. So if I choose that dot from the list here, not the dots container, but the first dot underneath that list. And what we're going to do is add a move response underneath the train. So move. Now the move properties looks a little bit different when it's underneath a chain. If we just add, so let's say I have, say I do a tap trigger here on, doesn't really matter what, but let's say I added a move response to something on here. You see I have just a position to move it to, right? When you have it under a chain, you have this, it's essentially what it does is it gives you a range. The first column is the range of how far you're going to scroll. And remember when I said that one full page scroll is 375 pixels. So what I'm going to do is the range of 0, that's when I'm on page 1, to page 2. I'm going to add 375 to the second one. So when I scroll from page 1 to page 2, I want something to happen. And on the right side is the position of the dot. Now I only want to move it horizontally. So I'm only going to change the X position, and I'm going to leave the Y position empty. And that essentially means don't change the Y position. Wherever it happens to be, leave it there. I only want to change the X position. Now the dot start position, which is already set up this way, is at 0 pixels. So in the move response under the chain, in the first row where you have the scroll position at 0, I want the dot to be at 0. And then when I've scrolled all the way to page 1 or scroll position of 375, I want the dot to be in that center position. So that center position here, if I click on that second dot in the palette here, you can see that it is at X20 pixels. So what I want to happen is when I'm at page 1 or 375 pixels scrolled, I want that dot to be at 20 pixels. Now, if I preview this, you're going to see when I scroll from page 1 to page 2, that dot should be moving. And if I scroll back and forth, you're going to see that dot moves. Now, what's going on here is ProtoPie is basically filling in the blanks underneath here. You set the extents. When the scroll is at 0, I want that dot to be at 0. And when the scroll is at 375, I want that dot to be at 20. And then anything in between, ProtoPie is filling in the blanks. So if I scroll to the halfway point, ProtoPie will automatically put that dot at the 10 pixel point. So I can show that to you again. I'm going to scroll really slowly here. So you can see as I scroll slowly, that dot is moving slowly. It's moving at the exact same speed, by the way, that I am scrolling. So if I go fast, that dot moves fast. But if I go slow, it goes slow. And then you can see I've got my scroll position at about the halfway point, and you can see that dot's at the halfway point. And then if I scroll all the way to page 1 or page 2, I mean, that dot is now on page 2. All right. You can see right now, we don't have the dot moving on the page 3. We've only set up the scrolling between page 1 and page 2. In the chat, can anyone tell me what I would need to do in order to set up this to scroll to the third dot? I'll give you a message in there. If you don't know, that's okay. I'm going to show you anyway. The plus icon, yeah. So there's a bunch of ways you can do this. And the plus icon is one of the ways that I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you a bunch of different ways, actually. The longest way that I could do, I could literally add another chain trigger. So on the page and container, and yes, Matt, you're correct. And I'm going to show you that as well. So the longest way I could do that is I could literally add another chain trigger. And I can set this up, page, scroll, and I can do a move on the dot. And I can say when I'm at 375, and then the second page, of course, is 750. That's twice the width of the thing. I can start it at 20 because that is the starting point of page 2. And I can end it on 40. And this will work just fine. So if I go from 2 to 4, you can see this is working. But as a couple of you have already mentioned in the chat, there are more succinct ways to do this. And you don't have to put this into 2 different chains. You can use a single chain to do it. Sorry, I'm going to undo that for a second. I could literally add a second move command in here. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to move this one underneath there. And this one will work too. So if I preview this and I move from page 1 to page 2, you're going to see that second move works. You can have multiple responses under a chain command, and they don't have to be for the same object. You can chain multiple items to your whatever your master object happens to be. So if I wanted to say move this button as a result of moving the page, I could do that as well, all in the same one. But as a couple of you did mention, there are better ways to do this. So I'm going to remove this move, and instead on this move, I could hit this plus button down here. And I can add a second range in here. And I can make my start point of 375, 750, and 20, and 40. And this will work just fine too. But as Matt mentioned, the simplest and most succinct way to do this, now if you recall what I told you about how the chain works, ProtoPie fills in the blanks. So when I get to the halfway point, that dot is moved to the halfway point. Very conveniently, these 3 dots are spaced an equal distance apart, meaning that when I am on page 2, that dot is at the halfway point between dot 1 and dot 3. So what I could do is just a single chain that says when I'm at 0, I put the dot at 0, and I'm on page 3 or 750 pixels, that dot is in position 3 or 40 pixels. And ProtoPie will fill in the blanks for what's in between. So I'm going to delete the second range, and I'm going to modify this one instead. And I'm going to make my endpoint of this range 750, and that is page 3. And my X point would be the third dot's X point, which is 40 pixels. And I'm going to change that to 40. And now when I preview this, you're going to see when I move from page 1 to page 2, ProtoPie is filling in the blanks. Page 2 is exactly halfway between page 1 and page 3. And therefore, the dot is halfway between dot 1 and dot 3. And because chain is a continuous linkage, right, that dot moves left and right as I page left and right, and will continue to do that. There's nothing you need to do to restart that or stop that. It just continually will be associated with that. And if I had 5 pages, 6 pages, 7 pages, I could set it up in the same way and add more dots, and it will continue to work just fine. So that's the chain trigger. Now, before I move on to the third demo, does anyone have any questions about chain? Is that working for everybody? Okay, great, nothing in the chat. Let's go on to the third demo. The third demo will be looking at something called the range trigger. The range trigger is similar to the chain trigger, but it's a little bit different. The chain trigger works with a continuous linkage. With one property, as it changes, another property continues to change. With the range trigger, you're defining a range at which something will happen, and it's at one point in time. Let me play this little video here. I'm moving this red box around, and then when I cross over from the left side to the right side, the red box gets bigger. You're going to see it, and it's going to do it again here. What we've done is we've set up a range to say when that box crosses the halfway point, then the box's scale will get bigger. So let's assume that this whole width here is 2000 pixels. That dotted line is at the 1000 pixel mark. I've done is I've set up a range that says when the position of this box is at 1000 pixels or greater, the scale gets bigger. Now, it's important to note that the change happens when you cross over that threshold. It is a single point in time. So when it crosses over from the left side to the right side or into that range we've defined, that's when the change happens. It's not a continuous change in the same way that chain is. In this demo, what we're going to do is we're going to set up the range trigger to fire when we move from one page to the next and start a video playing. So this one is when I move from the second one. There we go. That video starts playing. And when I move to the third one, that video starts playing as well. I want the video to start playing when I get to that page, which is why we're going to use the range trigger instead of the chain trigger. Now, this one's a little bit more difficult to understand. So if anyone needs me to go through what I just said again before I jump into the demo, can you just let me know in the chat? Okay, then in that case, let's jump in. So we're going to be using the same scene we were on before. And if I preview this, when I move from page 1 to page 2, I'd like the video to start playing. And page 2 to page 3, I'd like the video to start playing. And much like we added a chain trigger to the paging container, we're going to add a range trigger to the paging container. So I'm going to select the paging container from the layers list, add trigger, range, second one down in the middle column. And as with the chain, I want my range to be on the scroll property of the paging container. Now you've got these 4 icons down here that you have a choice for how you want to set up your range. These 4 icons mean in order. The first one is when the scroll property is equal to or greater than a value you set here. The second one is when the scroll property is equal to or less than a value you set here. The third one is when your scroll property is between 2 values and includes those 2 values, by the way, and that's going to be important. We'll talk about that in a second. And the fourth one is when it's outside those 2 values and again, includes those values. So if I were to put here 10 here and 20 here, the range will fire when it's 0 to 10, not when it's 11 to 19, and then 20 and above. For the first one, for the first page, I want that video to play when I'm on page 1, and I'm going to use the second one. And the scroll position is 0. So when the scroll position is 0 or less, and the scroll really can't go less than 0. I mean, it does a little bit if you can consider that you can stretch it to the left a little bit. But when the scroll position is 0 or less, and you can see I can go a little bit less there, I want that video to play. So I'm going to set it up with the second icon. I'm going to put 0 in here, and then I'm going to add a response. And the response I want is the playback. I have 3 videos, by the way. The paging container has 3 videos. And what I want is that first one to start playing. So video 1 is page 1, video 2 is page 2, video 3 is page 3. I want video 1 to start playing when I'm on page 1. So I'm going to add a playback response to video 1, and I'm going to choose play. It's already set there. And you're going to see when I preview this, ProtoPie already recognizes that my paging container is in that threshold of 0, and therefore it plays that video. And when I move on to 2, I want the same thing to happen with video 2. And when I move on to 3, I want the same thing to happen with 3. So I'm going to name these because we're going to have to use multiple range triggers on here. And it's really important that you name your triggers and layers, especially when your list starts to get a little bit long. So I'm going to do range page 1, and I'm going to do the playback video 1. And I'm going to add another trigger. I'm going to add another range trigger. And this will be, again, for the scroll position of the paging container. And this one, I'm going to skip page 2 for a second, because that's going to be a little bit more complicated than the rest. I'm going to go right to page 3. We'll come back to page 2 in a second. So I'm going to do range page 3. And in this case, I want this to happen when I am at the 750 pixel mark. So 750 pixels or greater, I want that video to start playing. So my range here, I'm going to use the first icon, which is a value or greater. I want when the scroll position is 750 pixels or greater, then I want to start the playback of video 3. I will add a playback response. The select layer is video 3. And again, I'm going to rename this so we can at a glance know what's going on. And if I preview this, when I scroll to page 3, there we go, the third video is starting. All right, so now let's think about how page 2 can work. Which of the 4 icons would we use for it? So I'm going to add a chain trigger, or a range trigger, I mean. Range trigger, paging scroll, we have 4 icons to choose from. We've got the less than, greater than or equal to a value, less than or equal to value, between 2 values, or outside 2 values. Which one do you think? It's in between. Yes, that's correct. Can anyone tell me between what values? All right, 371 and 749, 375 and 750. Okay, we have a couple of guesses in here. So the 375 and 750 is a pretty close guess. But if you recall, that 375 and 750, or the way that the range trigger works, it includes both those values. And if you remember, 750 is also the value for page 3. And we don't want the video to play on page 3. We want it to play on page 2, which is at 375. And let's see, 749. Okay, so 749 is a good number to work with. So let's work with that. So we use 749. So whenever this page is between 375 and 349, we want the second video to play. So I'm going to do playback video 2 and want to play. And I'm going to name these again. So page 2 and playback video 2. And I'm going to guess that this is going to work. So let's preview this. I move from page 1 to page 2. Page 2 video is playing, great. And I move from page 2 to page 3. Page 3 video is playing, fantastic. Now what happens when I move from page 3 to page 2? Or page 2 to page 1? or back to page 2, or back to page 3. My videos aren't playing. Can anyone tell me why my videos aren't playing? Yeah, they've already played, that's correct. So the videos have played to the end. So they're sitting on the last frame. And then when you try to play it from the last frame, it's just gonna stop playing. So it technically is playing, but because you're already on the last frame, it doesn't have anywhere to go. So we need these videos to reset. So as we move from one page to the next, we're gonna reset these videos. So that way, the next time we move into those ranges, those videos will start playing again. So when I move from page 1 to page 2, I'm gonna reset this. So video 1 is playing, and then when I move on to page 2, video 2 starts playing. Video 1's now off screen, so now would be a good time to reset that video. So under my range 2, I'm gonna reorder these, by the way, so now they're in order. So page 1, page 2, page 3. On my page 2 here, I want to reset video 1 because it's no longer visible. So what I can do is I can add a response here, and I can use the reset command. That's bottom right-ish. And I want to reset video 1. All right, let's preview this. Let's just make sure that this worked as we expect. So now when I move from page 1 to page 2, video 2 is playing. Now when I move back to page 1, yeah, video 1's playing. Yeah, wonderful. Okay, we need to do the same thing. We need to do the same thing when I move from page 1 to page 2 and then back to page 1. I now need to reset video 2. So when I move to page 1, I'm going to reset video 2. Reset video 2. Again, I'm going to rename these. You'll notice too that these are animating. And we don't really see it because they're off screen, but if you were to go fast enough, you might actually see this happening. But with the video, the reset, I think it just happens in a single frame. But if you wanted to make sure that that reset happened instantly, you can set the duration to 0, by the way. And therefore the reset will just happen. The second we're on page 2, video 1 instantly resets. Second we move to page 1, video 2 instantly resets. And same when we move now. So if I go back and forth between page 1 and page 2, page 1, video restarts, page 2, video restarts, great. Now when I move to video page 3 and I move back to page 2, my video 2 is not restarting. I have to do a reset as well when I move from 2 to 3. I need to reset video 2 again when I move to page 3. So I'm going to add another reset here. Reset video 2. And again, I'm going to make the duration instant. Video 2. Now, if I preview this, I move from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, back to 2. 2 is now playing, and back to 3. 3 is not playing because I didn't reset video 3 when I moved from 3 to 2. So on my page 2, I'm going to add another reset. Reset video 3. And I'm going to set my duration to 0 again because I want this to be instant. And I'm going to rename these as well. I like to rename all of my triggers and responses so that way I know what's going on at a glance here. I could do the same for my chain, by the way. I can do chain of the paging scroll, for example, and then move dot. So I can see that when my scroll moves, I know that my dot's going to move just at a glance. It's a good idea, especially when your list of interactions gets really long. Having these named really helps. Okay, so I added, by the way, the reset to video 3 when I move back to page 2. And now when I move from page 1 to page 2, video starts playing. 2 to 3, 3 starts playing. 3 to 2, 2 starts playing. Back to 3, 3 starts playing, et cetera, et cetera. This is all working almost perfectly. But there's one little interesting thing that's going on here. You're going to notice that when I move from page 2 to page 1, so I'm going to go on here and I've scrolled most of the way, but that video is not playing yet. That video doesn't play until I actually scroll all the way to page 1. And same thing with going to page 3. So when I go all the way to page 3, that video doesn't play until I scroll all the way to page 3. But when I move from page 3 to page 2, so I'm going to move part of the way. You say I've only scrolled halfway, but that page 2 video was already playing. Does anyone have an idea of why that might be happening? Okay, that's okay. What we've done is for the range 2, we've set up a range of 375 to 749. And if you recall the way that range works, the change happens when you cross into that range. So when I'm moving from page 3 at 750 pixels, and I move into page 2, the second that scroll position hits 749, then that video is going to start playing. We don't want it to happen until I'm on 375. So does anyone know how I could modify this such that my video will only play when I move from page 3 all the way to page 2? Okay, Matt says 375 to 376. And yeah, that's pretty good. That'll work. Oh, where's my mouse? Here we go. So let's do that. So if I were to do 376 in this field, right, and I move from here and I go from 3 to 2, right, and let's go really slow. You're gonna see that video is not playing and doesn't play until I let go, right? And that's pretty good. And that's probably more than good enough for any prototype you want to do. But you can get pixel precise here. So essentially you've set up a range of 2 pixels, right? You can set this up such that it is just 1 pixel. If you recall the way I said that range works, when you set up your range here, it is, 375 to 376. It's inclusive of the value at the beginning and the value at the end. So when the scroll position becomes 376, this will fire. And then from the other side, when the scroll position becomes 375, this will fire. So because it includes both of these values, it's possible to have a range of 1 pixel by setting this to 375. So essentially, when I'm coming from page 3 to page 2, right, that range won't trigger until the scroll position hits 375 because it's inclusive of this outer bound. And when I'm moving from page 1 to page 2, playback won't start until the scroll position is hit 375 because the lower bound is inclusive inside this range. So now when I preview this, and I'm going to go from page 1 to page 2, and page 2 to page 3, now when I move backwards, that doesn't start until I actually hit page 2 right on the dot. And similar when I move from page 1 to page 2 right on the dot. And that is the range trigger. Anyone have any questions on that before we move on to the rest of this? How can we animate the dots to have opacity? Okay, would you like them to be opacity on the range? So essentially when I'm moving back and forth, where am I? I'm going to go back to my preview here. So when I'm moving the dots back and forth, essentially, maybe you want them to go invisible at the halfway point and then fully visible here and then invisible at the halfway point. Yeah, okay, good. Yes, we can do that. And we can do that with the same chain that we went on here. Now, remember when I said that you can have multiple responses on here? We can add an opacity response onto here. So let's add an opacity response to the dot. And I had dot selected in the layers palette here, but you can see if it's not selected there, just make sure it is here. So opacity dot. And when the scroll is at 0, I want that opacity to be at 100. So I have scroll on one side, which is my master, opacity of the dot on the right side, which is my response. I want that to be 0. I want my opacity to be 0 at some point. At what point, at what scroll point do I want the opacity to be 0? Anyone know? In between, yeah, in between 0 and 375. So what we could do is we could do a little bit of math here. We do 375 divided by 2. ProtoPie is fantastic. It lets you do math in the field, so you don't have to do it in your head. And it puts it at exactly the halfway point, right? So, okay, let's preview this. Let's see if that worked. So as I move, you can see that dot is fading out. And when I go to the second one, it didn't fade back in. Why not? We need another one. That's correct. So we can add this in here. And my start point is 187.5. My opacity is 0. And then my endpoint is on my page 2, which is 375. And my opacity goes back to 100. And if I preview this and I move from page 1 to page 2, so halfway point, it's disappeared. And then as I get to page 2, there we go. So it happens quickly though. So when you're just swiping like normal, you don't even see really the opacity go back and forth. You only really see it when it goes slowly. But if I were to space out these dots, for example, right, you might see it more. We could do the same thing between 2 and 3, but it's essentially what we've done. We would make another one, started at 375, 100, and then 750. We don't want divided by 2, so we want 375 plus 187.5. It'd be 0, and then another one for 750. Oops, sorry, not that. I want 562.5, 0, and 750, 100. And now I have that fading effect between the dots happening between page 1 and page 2, and page 2 and page 3. You can put as many responses as you want underneath here. And like I said, it doesn't even have to be the same object on here. I could do something with the get started button on here, right? I could have it such that this moves up and down as you page left and right, or the IoT text, it moves around, or maybe it changes color or whatever. Or you could have another text field that actually has the page number on there, and that can update as you go. You can have as many responses on as many objects, all chained to that same property. Did that answer the question? Great, excellent. Any other questions? Okay. So that's the end of the demos. What I want to show you here is just a couple more examples of the difference between chain and range here. So you can see in the example on the left, you can see the dot moves as the paging happens. So this is the same thing. We could have done the dots with a range trigger instead of a chain, right? But there's a subtle difference between the two. You'll notice that the chain, the dot moves as you page, right? So that's a continuous relationship between the scroll position and the X position of the dot. If we were to instead have used the range trigger for moving the dots, you're going to see that the dot doesn't move until I have fully paged over. In the same way that the video didn't start until we fully paged over, the dot doesn't move until we've decided to move all the way on there. And that also means that that dot will always move that fast when you go on there. Whatever speed you set for the animation, it's going to happen at that speed whenever you use the range trigger here. Whereas with the chain, if I were to page slower, and I showed you this in the example earlier, if I were to page slower, if I swipe slower, I should say, then that dot moves slower. The dot will move at the same speed at which I am scrolling with my paging. Is that clear, the difference between chain and range? All right, excellent, good. So what else can you learn based on what you learned today? So I've got a couple of examples here that are a bit animated. This is a great example of how you could use the chain for a number of different things. So as we scroll up and down, there's a 3D transform that's done on this, this card, this credit card balance card that you see on there. And as I scroll up and down, that 3D transform is affected by the scroll position. In the same way that we had the position of dot moving left and right, we could have chained a 3D transform, and I think that's the z-axis value of the 3D transform to the scrolling up and down. You'll also notice that when I scroll all the way to the top, then this total balance of 26,000 also moves up in relation to the scroll position. So that's an example of how you can do a chain. Here's an example of how you could use the range trigger. So this is an example of, and you see this on Apple's website when you're looking at one of their new products, for example, and you scroll from one page to the next. As I scroll from one page, when I get to one page, a bunch of things happen. So you could use the range trigger to detect when something like that happens. And that is it. That is the end of today's session. So if anyone has any questions, we're going to use the next few minutes for a bit of Q&A. Does anyone have any questions at all on what we've covered today? Maybe some different ways you might want to use this? All right, well, no questions at all. I just want to cover what the next session will be. So I'll be running this one again next week. And in the next session, we're gonna, that's the part 2 of the advanced, by the way. And this is when we're gonna start learning variables and formulas. And these are some of the most powerful features of the way ProtoPie works. If you've ever done any programming at all, then you're gonna be familiar with what a variable is. But if you're not, that's okay, because we're gonna cover it. And also formulas, and they're similar. If you've ever used Excel and you've done a formula in Excel, so to sum up, say, a bunch of cells or create an average or something like that, formulas in ProtoPie work very similar to that. So we can do some very dynamic things based on the changing state of your prototype. And it makes it possible to make something that's believable as your final product. Can you please share the link to the Black project you showed us, who have done it? So, and that was this one here. Yep. Okay. Rebecca, do you have a link to that? Because I think we have. Here, if I click this, yes. Actually, here I can paste it here. Here we go. There's a link to that one. Oops, I should send that to everybody. There we go. Why is that going? No, I want to go to everyone. There we go. Sorry about that. Great. And then I don't know if you also noticed, but in the chat, Rebecca has left a link to a survey. Really helps us out if you could fill out that form for us and let us know how we did, what you learned, maybe you think how it could be better. You know, I mean, if you want to say that Jeff was amazing, that would also help me out as well. And if you want to say I wasn't amazing, well, please tell me why, because that helps me. Otherwise, that is the end of Advanced 1 for ProtoPie.